Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're so delighted to have a good number of people here on this Friday morning for our UC-wide Migration Institute book series. I'm Erin Hamilton. I'm affiliated with the Global Migration Center at UC Davis, and I'm taking over as moderator today as Stephanie Canizales and Roger Waldinger their lives have been disrupted by the fires in LA. And I assume that there are others who can't be here this morning because of that situation. And so I just wanted to take a second to extend our best wishes for safety and for a quick end to this crisis. Our thoughts are with the people of LA, and I wanted to put here in the chat some organizations that Stephanie sent around this morning that are doing work in LA to help immigrants. And this might be a good time to, if you're interested in contributing to give to those organizations. But we are really excited this morning to have Ulrike Bialas here to share about her book, Forever 17, Coming of Age in the German Asylum System. Ulrike is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Germany. She is a PhD from Princeton in sociology and is going to talk about how categories like age structure the social experiences of migration and how in turn immigrants and asylum seekers in Germany disrupt what we think of as natural categories like childhood. Following Ulrike's presentation, which I think will be about 25-30 minutes, we will hear from David FitzGerald, who is the Theodore Gildred Chair in U.S.-Mexican Relations and Professor of Sociology at UC San Diego. So thank you all so much for being here. If you have questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat as they come up, and we will also have a Q&A at the end of the session. And with that, I will turn it over to Ulrike.
Yeah, welcome everyone from me as well, and thank you for spending these next 1.5 hours or so with us or with me. I'm very much looking forward to it, and I feel very lucky to be here. And thank you to everyone who helped organize this event, and of course to Erin for moderating, to David for the commentary that he will provide after my talk. I actually remember first meeting David 5 years ago or so in Berlin when I was still very much in the middle of my fieldwork. And I think, struggling to articulate to him what my research was even about. So it's a full circle kind of moment to now be able to hear his thoughts on the actual book. And finally, like Erin just said, I mean, I also have been following the news about the ongoing fires in Los Angeles. And yeah, I'm totally shocked and saddened. And since many of you are probably in the region, even the ones on this call, I just hope that you and everyone you know is okay. So thank you again, everyone, and let me begin. Let's see. Okay. So as I'm sure many of you know, hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied young people have migrated to Germany from different parts of the global south and applied for asylum. And these movements peaked now almost a decade ago, and they're often associated with the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16. But of course, they also took place before then, and they have continued since then. And many of these young asylum seekers do not have identifying documents, and often they do not actually know their exact age because a date of birth just doesn't have the same legal or cultural importance in their countries of origin. And the German office, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, actually estimates that more than half of all asylum seekers do not provide identifying documents with their asylum application. And from certain countries of origin, for instance, Somalia, Guinea, or Afghanistan also, which also happen to be some of the most common countries of origin for young migrants in Germany, almost nobody has these types of documents. In Germany, however, as in many other countries, a date of birth is immensely important because both national German laws and international agreements that Germany has ratified distinguish precisely between minors and adults, so between those under 18 and those who are 18 and up. And to give you just a few examples of the kind of consequences of this legal distinction, So minors can choose the EU country in which to file for asylum rather than having to live in fear of a deportation to the country through which they first entered the European Union in accordance with the Dublin Agreement. They cannot be deported until they turn 18, which gives them valuable time to prepare their asylum application and interview. They have more legal alternatives for residence titles if their asylum application ends up being rejected. They are supported by guardians and caseworkers. They live in youth welfare, so in actual apartments, not these infamous crowded camps. They attend regular schools and have the option of graduating with a degree. They have access to better health care, including mental health care, among many other benefits, let's just say. And because of these high stakes, Germany uses different kinds of age assessments, including visual and forensic ones, to essentially classify and identify these migrants. And these high stakes, on the other hand, are the reason why many of the young migrants in turn feel compelled to present as minors, particularly if they do not know their exact age anyway, because they see minority age as their best chance, or maybe even their only chance, for a safe future in Germany. And there's actually this joke among age examiners and others who are suspicious of asylum seekers' claims to minority age that these young people want to be, quote, forever 17. And this remark inspired the title of my book, not only because it, I think, captures the excessiveness and the kind of snark in the rhetoric around youth migration in Germany and these age assessments, and also, on the other hand, these kind of overdrawn, unrealistic expectations among young migrants, but also because young migrants who desire to be 17, let alone forever 17, are almost inevitably disappointed by what that actually means in reality, as you will hear in a minute. So between 2016 and 2020, and a bit less intensely also after that, I conducted ethnographic fieldwork in Berlin with forensic age examiners, social workers, legal guardians, and most importantly, young migrants whose ages were contested. And I focused on young men as opposed to young women because not only, I mean, first of all, the vast majority of young asylum seekers in Germany are men, but then also the issues that emerged as most interesting to me, like this public and state suspicion over their age, as well as their own sensitivity to feeling, belittled and infantilized as minors. These things just seemed more pronounced among young men than young women. So I observed age assessments, I interviewed forensic medical examiners and social workers. I volunteered with an organization that matches volunteer legal guardians and unaccompanied minors. I joined asylum seekers for appointments with lawyers, migration bureaucrats, doctors, teachers, caseworkers, and so on, but also increasingly just spent their free time with them to basically see how the whole issue with their age, like the negotiation of their date of birth, the suspicion and secrecy around it, and ultimately also their classification as either a minor or an adult, how that affected their whole life. So I would say, in a way, my fieldwork went through three pretty distinct phases. First of all, observing age assessments and talking with forensic scientists and social workers. Then secondly, being involved with this organization for unaccompanied minors and joining migrants to official events and appointments. And then thirdly, and this was by far the longest or the most amount of time, just spending daily life with young migrants whose ages were contested. So for 4 or 5 years, the research for this book and the people that I got to know were really a very big part of my life. And it's, impossible to condense all of that into a book, let alone a book talk. If there are any ethnographers listening, I'm sure that you can relate. So for today, I've decided to focus on just one young man who I call Samir in the book, and who is one of its central figures. And I think his story illustrates quite well the significance of age to German migration governance and the asylum system in particular, the complexity of age as a legal and social category, but also the tension, and I would even say often absurdity, that age can produce when it's unknown, and if we're being honest, unknowable, yet relied upon as this kind of track switch for life in Europe. So let me tell you about Samir. Just so you have an idea of the kind of person that he was, let me briefly read an excerpt of how I introduce him in the book. Samir was scrawny and squirrely. made a few inches taller by a tuft of disheveled dreads on top of his head, usually adorned with small white or silver beads. A teacher once said of him that he didn't go through life, he danced through it. He was quick-witted and quick-moving, and I often marveled at how well he knew my home city after only a few years. He could show me, a native-born Berliner, the fastest shortcuts, the cleanest public restrooms and reliable free Wi-Fi, the most secluded benches from which to gaze at the moon in the middle of the night, and the waterfronts from which to watch it fade again at daybreak. He could be charming and funny when he wanted to get his way or genuinely liked someone, or combative and rude when he sensed someone's disrespect or was simply in a bad mood, disheartened by a life that never quite seemed to go his way. Samir's street German, as he called it, was literal and full of poetry. He had the ability to make his point in words so simple and poignant that they stuck with me. Once at a coffee shop, the barista asked if he took his coffee with milk or sugar. Samir grabbed the paper cup and said, "With sun," as he stepped out into the golden hour. So I met Samir when I was volunteering with this organization that I just mentioned, which essentially was matching Germans who wanted to volunteer as legal guardians with young migrants in need of such a legal guardian. And Samir had been born in Sudan to Eritrean parents. His family lived in a refugee camp near the Sudanese-Eritrean border. And although Samir had been able to create a childhood and youth for himself, surrounded by friends, constantly involved in games and adventures and flirtations, just because of the kind of person that he was, outgoing and spontaneous and spirited and thrill-seeking. His life was also undeniably marked by poverty, by disenfranchisement, by discrimination, sometimes violent conflict, and just kind of a general sense that prospects were lacking, basically, for his future. So even as a young teenager, 12, 13 years old, he had announced to his family that he wanted to go to Europe, which his parents vehemently forbade. On one of the occasions when he again dreamt of how different his life would be if only he could spend it in Europe, his uncle warned him, "Do you want to end up like your cousins?" And here he was referring to his own two sons who had tried to make it to Europe a year earlier and had drowned just off the shore of the Italian island of Lampedusa. But Samir, as he told me, replied, "I don't want to end up like you." And by you, he meant all the people he saw around him who technically were adults, but who were not leading the kind of life that makes adulthood attractive to teenagers, including things like financial independence, security, respect, autonomy, freedom, fulfillment, dignity, these types of things. So eventually, Samir left without saying goodbye. And as a side note, I mean, there's this idea, at least it's quite prevalent in the German media and public discourse, that unaccompanied minors are sent by their families, like even against their will, that youth migration is a family project. And surely that is the case for some, but the young men I came to know overwhelmingly left without the approval of their parents, often without their knowledge. Really, I think in an attempt to break free from a kind of stifled adolescence and to succeed elsewhere on their own merit, like to become adults. So after making the journey through Libya and the Mediterranean Sea, which I don't have time to go into, but the horrors of which I'm sure many of you are aware of. And on the screen here on the left, you can see a still from a video that another passenger took of their boat crossing, as well as on the right, one of Samir's doodles that he often kind of did when telling me about something, in this case, the journey through Europe. So Samir finally arrived in Germany. He first went to Munich, where his half-brother was already living, but he quickly realized that living under the watchful, often judgmental eye of an older relative was precisely not what he had envisioned for his life in Europe. So he moved on to Hamburg. Friends of his from Sudan were already living in Hamburg, and they told him that in order to live with them, he would have to say he was an adult as well, because as a minor, he would be put on youth welfare. His plan backfired, though, because by telling the migration authorities in Hamburg that he was an adult, they now had the right to redistribute him within Germany. So because asylum seekers would otherwise cluster in certain parts of Germany, the country assigns particular quotas of adult asylum seekers across the 16 German states for a more fair and manageable also distribution. So Samir was transferred to Berlin, where he was put up in a former gym turned refugee camp with hundreds of others. And he referred to this period of his life as the time when he was sleeping underneath a basketball hoop. As an official adult, he was largely on his own. He did not attend school. He started getting into drugs, both consuming and selling them. He let a tuberculosis infection go untreated. He had frequent run-ins with the police, among many other struggles and troubles that first year. A social worker at the camp helped him to submit his asylum application, but there was no one to advise him on how best to prepare for his interview. He did eventually enroll in a German class, and he told his teacher that he was a minor, which she immediately believed because his kind of boyish face and lanky walk and playful nature, but also his difficult behavioral traits like his tardiness, his occasional rudeness, his unreliability. These things did not make him seem like an adult in her eyes. So she contacted our organization, informing us that a student of hers needed help correcting his official age, and that once he had successfully done so, she then wanted to become his legal guardian. She did not realize that it would take nearly 2 years for Samir to become a minor again, and that both the kind of path to renewed minority age, but then also his eventual life as a minor would be extremely taxing, full of ups and downs and setbacks. She quickly lost interest in helping Samir after just a couple of months when she realized that his legal situation was much more complex than she had initially recognized. But also, I think when she realized that Samir was a more complex person than she maybe had let herself or allowed herself to see when they first met. So he wasn't just a young person in need, but also a young man who had substance abuse issues, who was probably traumatized, who often acted out aggressively, then withdrew completely, and so on. And by the way, this kind of initial naivete eventually yielding to a certain bitterness about volunteer work not being as rewarding as they had hoped is a development that I witnessed quite often among volunteers, but that is just a side note. So Samir and I spent the next almost 2 years trying to correct his age. Although the word correct soon turned out to be not quite appropriate because he had confided in me that he was 21 or 22, he wasn't sure. And you can see from the identity document here on the left that over the years of trying to become a minor, he had collected various dates of birth. But to make a very long story short, he was eventually able to convince his asylum interviewer that he was 17. And it's hard to say whether the man was actually convinced or just indifferent. But in any case, he instructed Samir to go to the foreigner registration office and pick up a new ID card with the date of birth that he had just updated in the Central Register of Foreign Nationals. When Samir and I went to the office to pick up his new ID, the clerk there simply changed his date of birth with a ballpoint pen. And in doing so, he accidentally recorded a wrong month of birth and made Samir 3 months younger than he had even claimed to be. When we left the office, Samir was absolutely ecstatic. He had often imagined what his life in Germany would look like if only he could be 17. And he had always insisted that, if only the German state changed his age, he in turn would change his life. If only he could be 17, he said, and he didn't have to live in a camp anymore, he would stop dealing drugs, he would try to graduate high school, he would go to bed each night by 11, he would buy a TV set, he said, and spend the evenings indoors, cooking and watching TV shows to improve his German. Maybe he said he would even get a gym membership. So he really thought of turning 17 as a kind of panacea for everything that wasn't great about his life in Germany, that he had not learned proper German, that he hadn't received proper care for his myriad health issues, that he lived in a camp with no privacy, that he had messed up his asylum application and interview. And he truly seemed to think of turning 17 as a second chance and a way to do over and kind of relive his first years in Germany. Only a few weeks later, however, and again, I'll now read a short excerpt from the book. Samir declared, "Fuck 17." He had indeed enrolled in school, but his patchy German had made him difficult to place. He spoke quite well, but without formal education, he was barely literate and only knew street German, as he called it. Being in a beginner's class was frustrating and humiliating. The State Office for Refugees, from which adult asylum seekers received their money, had stopped paying him because they were no longer financially responsible for him, given his new minority age. His camp had kicked him out because they were not allowed to house unaccompanied minors. This forced Samir to move into a shelter for youth in crisis, with 24/7 supervision. We went to the youth welfare office repeatedly, reminding them of their obligation to put Samir up in one of their apartments, but the employees there were wary of an asylum seeker suddenly being 3 years younger. They claimed to be short of suitable apartments, while making no secret of the fact that they did not believe Samir was 17. He had lost the only advantage of being a legal adult, his freedom, and had gained little in return. When Samir got into a fight and had to go to the emergency room, the hospital administrators kept us waiting for hours as they tried to decide whether to admit him to the children's clinic, since his ID said he was 17, or the adult clinic, since he was on file from a previous treatment as being 20. And I mean, if you speak some German, you will know which clinic we were eventually admitted to from the picture on the right. The day before his new official 18th birthday, the youth crisis apartment forced Samir to move out because they were not allowed to house adults. We went to a youth homeless shelter hoping that he could spend the night there, but they explained that they would have to kick him out at midnight when he turned 18. The adult homeless shelter also refused him because he would only be an adult after midnight and their intakes ended at 10 p.m. Broke, homeless, and humiliated, Samir realized that so far, turning 17 had solved nothing. So let me pause here for a second. I mean, there's much more detail, of course, to Samir's story, but this is as much as I wanted to share with you today in order to illustrate a few things that I think are striking about the role that age plays in the lives of asylum seekers in Germany. So in particular, I want to discuss three conundrums or predicaments that result from the intersection of the particularities of undocumented youth migration on the one hand and age classification on the other. So first, those at or near the critical legal age threshold of 18 are often the least able to prove their birth date. So what I mean here is that, it's only a particular group of migrants for whom a date of birth matters so much, right? It doesn't matter whether someone is 42 or 43 or even 24 or 25, but it matters enormously whether someone is 17 or 18. And as I mentioned earlier, the migrants near this age threshold, so on the cusp between adolescence and young adulthood, they also tend to be the ones that come to Germany without identifying documents, either because they lost them during flight or because they didn't have these kinds of documents in their countries of origin to begin with, or because knowing of the importance of their age in Europe, they do not want to identify themselves. So we have this convergence of migration without documents on the one hand and youth migration on the other hand that creates a large population in Germany whose ages are contested and being negotiated under extremely high stakes. And then secondly, young migrants come to Europe seeking to become men, only to find that they must revert to a state of boyhood in order to be able to stay. So what I mean here is that we know that many young men, and we know this from lots of studies, not just mine, particularly from countries with limited opportunities for social mobility, that they really view migration as a rite of passage into adulthood. So to them, Europe seems like a place where these adult milestones are still possible. So as one of my interlocutors always said, there's more life in Europe. But then in Europe, these young men realize that they actually have to turn into minors and delay adulthood even further in order to just be allowed to stay, let alone achieve any of the things that they imagined, like an education or financial security. And in the meantime, their friends back home often actually end up outpacing them, establishing adult lives while their old friends in Europe are living in youth welfare, officially as minors, patronized often by legal guardians and caseworkers, and also just set back even further by lengthy asylum procedures, not to mention the time that it takes to learn a new language and just establish a new life for yourself in a new country. So my interlocutors would actually sometimes speculate, whether they would have married, how many children they would have by now, whether they would have built a house or a business if they hadn't left. So this creates an inherent contradiction for young migrants. While posing as minors, maybe their only way to remain in Europe it runs totally and completely counter to the aspirations that brought them there in the first place. And then third, the autonomy and resilience that they displayed in enduring the journey to Europe works against them when they must present as vulnerable and dependent to secure their status as minors. So even though most of us probably, can't actually fathom what it's like, I think we've all read accounts or seen images of clandestine migration through the Balkan route, the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean Ocean, and we can kind of imagine what it takes to withstand that journey physically and in spirit. So during the journey, they've had to be physically strong and psychologically resilient, self-sufficient, courageous, flexible, street smart. But then in Germany, when they try to officially become minors or enter and remain in youth welfare, or just apply for protection as refugees, these very traits are held against them. So age examiners take bodies and personalities that display signs of maturity as signs of adulthood. Youth welfare officers argue that, someone who has made it to Europe all on their own has, in a sense, proven that he doesn't need help. And when deciding whether to grant someone protection or even just a deportation impediment, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees and courts also sometimes point to the fact that the applicant has had to be, resourceful and creative and resilient during their journey, and that these characteristics will help him survive even in an unsettled region under adverse, hostile circumstances. So while posing as a minor affords young migrants with the protections that I just mentioned, it also imposes significant personal costs on them because of these dilemmas. So young migrants must carry the burden of dishonesty very often and endure feelings of infantilization and emasculation by the very laws and institutions that also protect them and that make minority age so attractive in the first place. And I would like to kind of close my presentation by sharing what I take to be some of the bigger takeaways here. So unaccompanied youth migration and these age assessments in particular, which I did not discuss today, but which have their own chapter in the book if you are interested, they're incredibly politicized in Germany, and the debate about them tends to be, in my opinion, like politically overdetermined and often oversimplified. So in essence, there's one camp on the left, let's say, that emphasizes the inadequate treatment of minors, which often implies that any migrant who claims to be a minor is a minor and should be treated as one, and that basically age examiners or anyone else suspicious of migrants' identity claims are bigots. And then the other camp on the right emphasizes that adults are receiving protections that should be reserved for children by posing as minors. And this camp often implies that migrants who are tinkering with aspects of their identity, so whether it be their age or their nationality, story of persecution or whatever, that they're doing so out of some malicious wish to hide their true identity, to cheat, to milk the welfare state. And, irrespective of where I myself might tend in terms of my own values and politics, I think that neither of these perspectives holds up empirically. So simply put, yes, migrants do make false statements, but no, it's not because they're bad people. Overall, I think it's a really tricky situation because, on the one hand, we do need age cutoffs to protect children, which I think most of us would agree is a good thing and even a moral and legal obligation. And also, resources simply are limited. Like when thousands of people daily enter a city like Berlin, which is what happened during what we in Germany call the long summer of migration, not everyone can be accommodated in an apartment, right? And not everyone can receive one-on-one support and counseling. So you do have to make decisions about who gets what. On the other hand, I've tried to argue the current situation really isn't serving anyone because, first of all, it denies support to young adults that are just as vulnerable. It also virtually forces, I would say, young migrants to make themselves small. And it also embroils like lots of other people, including age examiners, social workers, volunteers, in this ultimately futile effort of age classification. So the question is, what do we do? And I have to say that I don't generally consider my role as an ethnographer to provide like policy suggestions, but I know that this is a question I always get, so I'm going to offer some cautious thoughts in this direction. As problematic as age assessments are, I do think that they should continue to be improved. Not because I think that they can say anything about the needs or deservingness of young adults, but simply to ensure that no minor is classified as an adult. But I also think that we should like take a step back and focus our energy on debating definitions of vulnerability rather than just methods of determining it. So what I mean here is that we need to remind ourselves that a date of birth in the end is a label, and that we care about dates of birth because of what we imagine they stand for: vulnerability, the need for protection. And, I mean, I think protecting the most vulnerable is a goal worth pursuing, but the question is whether a fixation on birth dates in the absence of birth certificates and for people whose childhoods differed radically from the ones that are typical of the societies where these chronological age standards originated, whether that serves that goal. And I think my research shows that it does not. So I think we ought to remind ourselves of why we protect and support minors. And, whether it's because of their alleged vulnerability, their receptivity, malleability, their openness, or, maybe their special orientation towards the future, I think that young migrants who display these traits ought to be supported in their endeavors. And conversely, no young migrant should feel that he has to downplay his strengths and his accomplishments in order to qualify for assistance, because young people may be mature in one way, but then inexperienced or vulnerable in another way, particularly after having moved between continents under traumatic circumstances. And I think that our policies ought to be sophisticated enough to accommodate such complexities and not flag them as suspicious or use them to disqualify someone from help. And then finally, I think that we should grant amnesty to migrants who want to correct their age, their nationality, or some other part of their identity or story, but who are currently too afraid of the legal repercussions. And let me just tell you, there are many, many people living in Germany in this situation at the moment. And I think this is in our own interest in the end, because, secrecy and fear hinder real integration, or, let's say maybe belonging, for a less troubled term, because you cannot really establish like genuine relationships based on trust and honesty when you feel like you have to pretend indefinitely to be the person that you once thought was the only version of yourself who would be given a chance in Europe. So if we followed these approaches, and this is my conclusion in the book, then no one would want to be forever 17, because migration is not about status, right? It's not about forever, it's about mobility, not just in the physical sense, but also in the sense of, becoming, evolving, growing, all of which are impossible when you have to keep yourself perpetually small enough to fit a very narrow notion of deservingness and vulnerability strictly based on your chronological age. And all that being said, my most basic hope for this book is that it can show the complexity of the situation, and that it can kind of help direct our eyes to a category that I think we're not paying very much attention to right now: age, despite it fulfilling many of the criteria I think that make social categories so interesting to us social scientists, right? It's socially constructed, it's culturally contingent, it's used for political ends, it's the basis of a lot of stratification. But I think because in the global north, like in Germany, for instance, nearly everyone knows and is able to provide evidence of their date of birth, this makes age-based legal distinctions seem straightforward. And also, I think the chronological objectivity of age, so the undeniable truth that every one of us was indeed born on a specific day, like that leads to the misunderstanding that age as a social category is natural. And perhaps also age seems like a fair arbiter of rights and resources, because presumably everyone will inhabit the same age brackets over the course of their life, which is not the case for other category systems like race or gender. The problem, as hopefully I have shown, is that for migrants from countries where an exact age does not have the same legal or cultural importance, neither the first assumption, so that age is universally known and easy to measure, nor the second assumption that the burdens and benefits associated with particular age groups, when viewed over the course of a lifetime, are equally distributed, neither of those assumptions holds true. And on the contrary, I would say, the circumstance that I opened my presentation with is that many young migrants in Germany do not actually know their date of birth, let alone own official documentation of it, and they've not had the kind of childhood that their peers in Germany rely on to prepare them for this transition into adulthood. So I hope that as has been the case with other social categories, we will start doing more work to explain age as a category rather than kind of simply using it to explain other things that on the surface may seem more interesting. And finally, and this now is really my final word on this, besides directing our attention to the category age, I also simply wanted to direct our attention to these young migrants that we've all seen on the news as they try to cross our borders, risk their lives really, trying to cross our borders, and whose struggles definitely don't end once they have. I have to say that I really enjoyed getting to know some of them for my research and spending these years with them, which honestly were important and formative years for me as well. And today you heard a bit about Samir, but in my book, you can also read about Idris from Ethiopia and Paul from Guinea, Ali from Afghanistan, and many others who really have, I would say, pretty similar aspirations and hopes for their lives as many young people around the world, but who are asked to pay, in my opinion, an inordinately high price for that pursuit. So thank you for listening. I now look forward to David's commentary, first of all, and then to everyone's questions and comments and critiques. Thank you.
Okay, David, are you ready to offer some comments?
Yes, I'd be very happy to. And I also fondly remember this coffee with Ulrike in Berlin before the pandemic, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And ever since then, I've had the opportunity to be convinced by her that this process that seems really obvious about defining a person's age is actually this wobbly and really important social construction with all kinds of surprising consequences. So it's truly an honor to have been able to learn from her really deep expertise in this area. I should note that this book has already been awarded a couple of prizes that I'm aware of, at least from the German Sociological Association's Sociology of Knowledge section, and also the ASA section on international migration, Thomas and Zdenetsky Book Prize. So it's already receiving a lot of well-deserved recognition. There are many merits here, and I just want to highlight a couple before I get to the questions. One is that when it shows this paradox of young migrants who, on the one hand, need to show that they are vulnerable children, and yet on the other hand, the only way that they were able to get into that position was by using these very adult-like characteristics and street smarts. To me, that's also an extreme example of what all refugees do. They often exercise agency in extreme ways in order to be able to claim victimhood. So you can see that much broader phenomenon as crystallized in the experience of these young people. Like a lot of good social science, it makes the strange familiar. And it begins with some, what to me are very strange scenes. Begins with a scene of 150 young men simultaneously shaving in a boat in the Mediterranean in the last hour before being rescued by the Coast Guard. But it also makes the familiar strange. That prompted me to think about my own family history. My grandfather in the 1920s decided he would go to Flint, Michigan to work in the auto factory, but he was a child. He was a young teenager. So he forged a document and he lied about his age to be able to work in this factory. And then one day, a doctor came through during a vaccination campaign, and he was worried that he was going to be given the wrong dose, that he would be given an adult dose when he should be given the child's dose. So he confessed to his true age. And this book made me think about the way that there are these different domains of age as certified by the state, private businesses enforcing employment law, the medical field, and the collision between those different domains in a way that I wouldn't have really understood before I read this text. Setting aside the issue of age, it shows how the asylum process and all the different forms of integration or lack thereof related to that actually work on the ground. So there are lots of discussion here of experiences and nuances of law and action, bureaucratic discretion, all kinds of issues like that that you would never get just from studying the asylum laws alone. And it's especially rich in showing the perspective of asylum seekers and asylees. So that alone makes it really worthy of our attention as readers, I think. I should note that it's exceptionally well written. It's full of all kinds of smart observations about the absurdities of the process. It's not about a funny topic at all. It's extremely serious, but there are many moments of dark humor that come through. There are a lot of poetic quotations. We just heard some of the words of Samir, his own words about coming out of the coffee shop, with the sun, and also other really revealing quotations from authors outside the academy that lend this work an unusually literary feel. I recommend the epilogue on ethnographic research around politically sensitive topics. In this book series, we've had many discussions about the role of academics and policy relevant work. And in that part of the book, it squarely addresses the very uncomfortable issues about how research findings might be used in ways that would not be desired by the researcher, and methodologically how to use the role of being an active helper of some of the interlocutors, like this character Samir, to whom we've been introduced, as a way to gather evidence and understand the social worlds in ways that would otherwise be missed. There are many other merits, but let me get to some questions. So one of them has to do with just how social constructivist is this account. We read the chronological age as, quote, an undeniable truth. And the conclusion calls for improving age verification, which I found to be a little bit of a surprising position, given all of the attention in the text. And this didn't really come out in the presentation here, but there's a very interesting chapter about the process by which scientists try to figure out someone's age, looking at X-rays of bones and teeth and so forth. And she was deeply embedded in that process. That in itself is reason to read this book. But at the end of the day, it seems like rather than adopting the science and technology approach, which deeply influenced the literature review, as it were, at the end of the day, she's calling for more science. And a given technique might have some flaws or some uncertainties, but I get the sense that she feels that the scientific approach is self-correcting. And that makes all of this make age different from the other so-called legal fictions, like the legal fictions around the refugee migrant distinction or some other distinctions she makes in the book. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about just how social constructivist her stance is. Then at a policy level, Germany is, all cases are exceptional, but Germany really is a very important exceptional case here. We know that most refugees are in the global south, but Germany has very large absolute and relative to its population numbers of asylees, asylum seekers. So I'm wondering how German exceptionalism, in terms of its evident willingness to accept asylum seekers, at least relative to other countries, affect the dynamics in this book. Is age verification such an issue in other country cases? Then another set of issues is around how this might help us better understand theories of international migration. For many asylum seekers here, according to what we read, they're really unlikely to be granted asylum outright, and might not ever be granted asylum. And so many of them are in these liminal statuses, and the process drags on for years and years and years. And we read that for many, the only realistic goal is to lose their case slowly over the course of some years. So what are the implications for theories of international migration, which often writes about the notion of decisions, migrants making decisions at various stages of their trajectory? Given the fact that these decisions are unfolding over such a long time with so much ambiguity and uncertainty, they're shifting over time, how should we understand something like the aspirations, capabilities framework, or other ways of theorizing international migration? For example, we know that migrant self-censoring keeps accurate information from flowing back to the country of origin, and there's some really powerful examples of that in this book. But surely some of that negative information gets through. I wonder if this is related to the fact that there is not that much deportation from Germany relative to the percentage of the population that could be deported. Maybe the lack of physical deportees reduces the quality of that information even more. So perhaps we could hear some reflection on how these extended periods of liminality and uncertainty and the way that those would inform theories of perpetuation of international migration. And then lastly, the book forcefully makes the point that all of the secrecy and having multiple ages negatively affects integration. And we just heard that point made in an abstract sense. There's a lot of detail behind it, many examples in the flesh and blood of the text. But can you say more at a theoretical level about how secrecy affects migrant social networks in particular? And do the circumstances in this study suggest that social networks can operate differently from ways that are described in the dominant accounts in the international migration literature? So those are just a few questions I have to take two or three if you have the inclination now. But again, hats off for really a terrific text.
Thank you so much, David. Ulrike, would you like to respond to some of the comments from David? And then I will invite other attendees to please put your questions in the chat or raise hands. Or if you put your name in the chat, we'll call on you in that order after Ulrike has an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, David. These are such great comments. And I mean, I will have to re-listen to the recording of my own talk in order to, grasp some of these comments and really think about them in more depth. But I want to respond to a few of them. I mean, first of all, this wasn't a question, but just a comment about, your own family history with this. And this is something I encountered very often, which is kind of curious because so I would get, especially when I hadn't yet written the book, was like in the depths of the ethnographic fieldwork and trying to tell people what I was finding. I was often getting two reactions. One was, oh, this is way too sensitive, you can't write about this. And the other was, oh yeah, my granddad did the same thing, or my grandma did the same thing, or, I know this person in my family who did the same thing. So I always thought that was a curious contrast of, on the one hand, like, we can't say this about migrants. On the other hand, oh yeah, I know people who did this very thing for very similar reasons, like the ones that you've described. And the second thing that I think your anecdote illustrates that I didn't get to talk about in this presentation, but that I think is really important, is about the kind of ongoing repercussions of false identity claims. Like, when my interlocutors entered Europe, they were in such desperate situations that for the most part, they were just trying to find an immediate solution to their problem of, needing to stay in Europe, needing some level of support. And they're only now, I mean, it's now been, 8 years or so since I met some of them. And they're only now actually realizing that this is something that is going to stick with them forever. Like, they're only now starting to think about things like, what about my retirement age? Or, what about me not qualifying for free cancer screenings from my health insurance until, I've reached an age that's actually too late, or those types of questions. So thank you for that anecdote, because I think it illustrates a lot of important themes. You are not the first person to find surprising that one of my conclusions is to improve age assessments. I got a very similar comment from someone just last week. And I think it's fair because, as you say, I talk about the social construction of age, and I do think that one of the main points I'm trying to make is that, even if age assessments were to work perfectly, which they are never going to, even then, like, a chronological age might not actually be able to capture the thing that we're after. So I agree with you that it's somewhat surprising of me to make them one of my policy recommendations. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that, even though the book focuses for the most part on young adults who are trying to present as minors, I got to know hundreds of young migrants. And of course, there are also people who actually are minors who got classified as adults. And I do think that just for, the reasons that I've mentioned, I mean, the child protection laws that we should adhere to, those cases should not happen. And they do happen, and they happen maybe more often even than my book discusses, which is maybe a critique of my book. So that's why I made that one of my kind of, the things that I would try to change. German exceptionalism, yes, absolutely. I mean, age assessments do exist in other countries, but they are particularly prevalent in Germany, and they also created particularly heated debate in Germany, because between 2015 and, I mean, even now still ongoing, there have been lots of like famous cases of basically young migrants committing crimes or even acts of terrorism, and then during the investigation it being found out that they're not actually the age they said, and so this kind of like raised you know, Germans' awareness of this issue. But then most importantly, I would say, I mean, Germany is a welfare state, you know, with lots of things we can critique about it, but compared to other countries, a very generous welfare state, especially actually for asylum seekers and even rejected asylum seekers. So the stakes are very high. Like what you get when you're classified as a minor is probably more, I mean, without being an expert on it, but it's more than certainly what you get in other European countries. So I would say the stakes are especially high in Germany, you know, both for the state, which will have to spend lots of money on this minor, and of course for the migrants themselves. And then also, you know, the typical countries of origin, you know, of the movements of this past decade, make this issue of age assessments and age classification so much more pertinent because, you know, for instance, like, you know, I don't talk about Syrians in my book. And the reason is that Syrians, I mean, almost all of them, just like we, they know their date of birth and they have passports to prove them. So it's really also the particular countries that migrants to Germany have been coming from over the past decade, which are different, of course, than, for instance, migration to North America or other countries around the world, that has made age classification so important because, as I've said, they do not know their date of birth or can't prove it. One question was like, what could be like an interesting takeaway for the decision about migrants, the literature about migrants' decision making and aspirations, capabilities. I mean, I'll say one thing that this is not like a total answer to your question, but just one aspect that I found very interesting that I'm also like thinking about more and also actually doing some other research on right now, is this like moments when migrants make decisions about their papers that seem irrational. I know that's not the best word. I'm going to look for a better word in the future, but that just don't seem to serve them. Like I have examples in the book of where, for example, migrants could have very easily claimed to be from a country that would have likely gotten them asylum, or they could have married their German partner and received papers through them, but they decided not to do those things. And I argue that, you know, migrants, like all of us, have like, you know, moral frameworks, and they have emotional connections or like emotional ideas about certain papers and ways of getting papers that often lead them to decisions that from the outside may seem irrational, but that are because they're not based on trying to get like the greatest benefit or like pursuing the legal status or the legal identity that is the most beneficial and advantageous in terms of getting resources. But it's actually not surprising when you consider that legal statuses have a moral meaning and an emotional meaning, which I think age does too. And I try to illustrate that too in the book, that it's not just about getting like material practical benefits, but that these legal statuses and legal identities also take on like moral meaning and have emotional connotations. And this question about how secrecy affects migrants' networks, I mean, I think that's very interesting. It's actually, I'm applying for a research grant right now that would kind of explore that more, because I think it's a really interesting question. And from my observations, I mean, it very much affects them. I was actually very surprised and often saddened, to be honest, to see that it just, you know, walking around with a false identity or like, you know, parts of a crafted identity did not just affect their relationships to Germans, but even to people from their own countries who, you know, where I often thought like, is this really necessary? Like if on, you know, if on the one hand, everyone is aware that these false identities are so prevalent, then why do you have to be so careful even in your own community with them? But I think that it just goes to show like the enormous significance that these identities take on and like the real kind of ongoing fear. I mean, I'm curious, you know, from a researcher standpoint, but also from like the standpoint of a person who's very much was very much involved in the lives of her interlocutors and really cares about them. I'm very curious to see how this plays out over the next decades or so. I mean, even with things like, you know, having a partner eventually, having children, I'm personally very curious to see if they will continue, you know, what identity they will present to these close relatives, loved ones of them. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I kind of tried to at least say something about every question that you had. But I mean, these are very important questions that I think really showed that you thought very deeply about the book, which I'm very grateful for and want to thank you for. Yeah, and maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone in the room who would like to turn off their mic and ask a question? Perhaps raise your hand or drop your name in the chat. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Nicola.
Hi, thank you very much. First of all, for those of you who may not know me here, my name is Immaculada Garcia Sanchez, and I'm a professor at UCLA, and I'm involved in the leadership team of the Center for the Study of International Migration. And thank you, Ulrike, if I may address you by your first name. I was extremely fascinated listening to your presentation, and actually, I can't wait to read your book. And where I'm coming from childhood studies, which is a collection of, I'm an anthropologist, but it's a collection of historians, sociologists, and anthropologists, right? And as you know, in childhood studies, this issue of age has been a raging debate for decades, right? And of course, with this rejection of the biological, like the sort of the biological dimension to being the exclusive, right? The exclusive, criterion that you would use to classify who is a child and who is not. And we know that historically, who is considered a child, who is not considered a child, has changed. And especially in societies that are considered, like the weird societies, white European, industrialized, democratic, we know that there was this big shift, right? And they became very much child-centered in certain ways, right? So I wonder, of course, your book and how young people are put in this position, they have to fudge about their age. It's another wrinkle in another piece of empirical evidence of how messy age classifications can get. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more about how within Germany itself in the last few decades, the conception, because I don't want to impose too many ideas about how it had changed in the US and in other places, right? How in Germany the conceptions of childhood and has evolved, and whether the child-centeredness that may be going on there is similar to other places like the United States, and also about how listening to you, it seemed to me that there is this powerful perfect storm, and that's why there's this. The second part of the question is this almost like Germans and many other societies in continental Europe that are also welfare societies painting themselves into a corner in which, on the one hand, if you're a welfare society and you have these child-centered ideas of more contemporary childhood, then you feel compelled to offer all these services. But on the other hand, lack of resources and anti-immigrant sentiment becomes just like a powerful storm of contradictions. So that's also the second part of my question. But take any part that you think is interesting. And thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed your talk and found it very, very thought-provoking.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments and questions. And you're absolutely right that this, the fact that childhood, youth, minority age, all of these things. I mean, not just the legal thresholds, which are occasionally up for debate and occasionally change, right? But also the kind of cultural and social notions of childhood and what that means. The fact that that has changed, I mean, not only that it differs across the globe, but also that if you look historically, it's changed in even in the countries where, you know, we now take childhood for granted. This fact makes it even more absurd, I think, and kind of striking that, you know, for migrants, it would be, there's no recognition of the diversity of childhood experiences or the diversity of definitions of age, but that it's, you know, applied to this absurd degree of precision. So that, yeah, I totally agree with you, and that makes it all even more striking in my eyes. And to your question, yes, Germany has seen very similar, you know, very similar development of the conceptions and practices around childhood and this child-centeredness, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right to point out the kind of, you know, the duality that creates of this, you know, danger of binary age classification, but then also, you know, all of this welfare state apparatus. And I will say, I mean, something that I did not mention in the talk, but that I think is kind of interesting, and maybe for migration scholars also shows, like, you know, whatever, I'll say that at the end. But so, you know, like in the case of the young migrants that I wrote about, their ability to remain in youth welfare and to be treated as minors hinged on this 18th birthday. But actually, if you look in the legal texts in Germany, youth welfare does not end at 18, or not necessarily. You can stay in youth welfare from 18 to 21. And actually, during that period, the onus is on the state to prove that you do not deserve youth welfare. Then from 21 to 27, the onus reverses. So you can stay in youth welfare until you're 27, but now the onus reverses and you would have to prove that you still need youth welfare. So there is, like, in German law, there is a recognition that you know, that transition into adulthood is like a soft transition, and that it's not this hard cutoff, and that is applied, that kind of soft transition is applied to German youth, like in the foster care system, or Germans who are living in youth welfare, but it was almost never applied to the migrants that I accompanied. Often the people in the youth welfare offices spoke to the migrants, probably, you know, assuming that they didn't know about these laws, spoke to them as though, you know, with your 18th birthday, you are out and there's no option for that. And then, you know, when volunteers or legal counselors kind of pointed out that there actually is this transition, 18 to 21, 21 to 27, they usually found a way to circumvent that with some of the arguments that I've presented, like, you know, this person is resilient, has withstood this and that. Another small side note, and this is not from my own research because I wasn't doing research on that, but it's from social workers that I still stayed in contact with, who were working with some of the Ukrainian unaccompanied minors who came in 2022 or starting in 2022 to Germany. Interestingly, and maybe not surprisingly to some of us, these softer transitions into adulthood were applied to them more. That's what social workers at least told me. I cannot, you know, I did not do research on this, but this is anecdotally from what I heard. So that for those young people, unaccompanied young people from Ukraine who were maybe 18, 19, 20, they were more easily led into youth welfare than the migrants that I accompanied, who were very much treated as though, you know, 18 is the cutoff day. Yeah, that's maybe not quite an answer to your question, but maybe an interesting aside to this whole idea about, you know, childhood and transitions to adolescence. And yeah, thank you very much for that.
There's a question in the Q&A from David Abraham, and I'll read it unless, David, you would like to unmute and read it yourself. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe I will rephrase it some. Thank you very much for a very illuminating ethnographic discussion. I'm a little concerned about the larger political environment in which this takes place, right? I mean, the AfD is 25% of the vote and rising. Other conservative parties are topping the reactionary narratives. In Germany's case, Merz, you know, Trump here, and in other countries as well. And, you know, Denmark is social democratic. welfare society was one of the first to go hard against immigrants. So my, people in the liminal status change their names, their ages. It's an old historical story. David's example was, relatively recent, but go back to Martin Gare and all the kind of medieval stories of people reinventing themselves. But if you look at it not sympathetically, but skeptically or with some hostility, this is a guy who had a number of chances and he screwed up. And he did not successfully take advantage of the chances, which our quote unquote generous welfare society offered him. So I'm concerned about the production of this kind of ethnographic analysis in an environment which is not sympathetic, but actually quite hostile to protagonists like Samir. So I just welcome your comment on that.
Yeah, so I mean, if I understood your question correctly, like, I don't know if this is quite what you're saying, but like, should we produce this type of knowledge in an environment that, might use that for certain political ends that were not my intention? And like you say, who might not be as sympathetic to Samir and others as I am, and as maybe some of you in the audience are. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Well, I mean, not should we, social science has to be done. I mean, we are scholars, we do this, but, how do you package or, how do you offer recommendations besides a more precise definition of childhood? How do you offer a packaging or a contextualization which creates more sympathy potentially more sympathy in the eyes of those who are predisposed to see exploitation of the system as the main takeaway?
Yeah. I mean, that's an important question, and it's one that I didn't even initially expect to have to grapple with, because I will say that when I started this research project, I thought it was going to be like a very classic lab ethnography. I thought I was just going to look at these age assessments, and that was going to be my project. And then while I was watching the age assessments and, the migrants come in and out, I thought like I should know more. Like, they have these age assessments and then they go home and I have no idea what happens to them. And I should like, try to see what they make of all of this. And so I started, getting to know some of them. And even then I myself didn't expect to encounter as many cases of false identities as I eventually ended up encountering. So it was only like a few months into the research with the migrants that some of them explicitly said to me, like, look, I'm not 17. Some of them kind of just stopped trying to hide the fact that they were not 17. And so then I was suddenly in the situation, what do I make of this information now? And I certainly, I thought about that. There was even a point where I thought like, maybe I shouldn't publish this type of research. But I talked to my interlocutors who were of the opinion that I should, and also to colleagues. And, it's always the question, like, I really try to portray, the reasons in the book for why people decide to misrepresent parts of their identity. I try to show that it's not an easy decision, that it's a decision that follows them, that they feel guilty for, that has all of these unintended consequences. On the other hand, I think I also show some cases where like people really made advantages of the resources that they were given. So people who, we don't have a counterfactual, but people who came to Germany, let's say they were 19, 18, who knows, like young adults, and they were given the resources of youth welfare. They were given the opportunity to learn German, to have an education, to not have to live in a camp, to address their trauma, their health issues. And they really made use of that situation. And, I hate to talk in that kind of utilitarian, or like this kind of utility way, but they are the kind of migrant that Germany proclaims to need. Like they're now, they've done their apprenticeship, they speak great German, they're integrated, they work, So in that sense, I both try to show that, you know, migrants grapple with that decision and struggle with that decision, regret that decision in many cases. And on the other hand, that decision and the resources that come with it, like the resources that come with minority age, that lots of people also make really good use of them, that they're not, you know, wasted on them, if that's the language we want to use, but that people really make use of them and become the kinds of migrants that Germany, you know, claims to need. I mean, I will say that, yes, I mean, the climate, of course, is as you've described, you know, but there have also been some positive policy reforms, actually, amidst all of that, like including ones that affect my interlocutors, like more residence titles for people who've lived in Germany with essentially without a residence title and had to fear deportation. But again, all of these, I mean, that's not really a question. Maybe I'll just say that because it's interesting, like all of these new residence titles that Germany has created in an attempt to help people out of this liminal legality, they all hinge on being able to identify yourself and provide a passport. So lots of my interlocutors are actually not able to make use of it because they're too afraid to go to whichever embassy of the country that they said they're from, either because, you know, they said a wrong age or because it's not even the embassy of the country that they're actually from. And so I know lots of people who would rather indefinitely live without a residence title in Germany than like risk being exposed and go to some embassy. So that's just a side note. But I mean, I agree with you that it's a really tricky subject. And I will say that it's one that I continue to grapple with. I'm writing another a piece on this right now because it's something that is definitely on my mind. And yeah. But thank you for bringing it up because I think it's extremely important.
Thank you.
Question from Durana Sadie.
Hi. Well, first, I really appreciated this talk, and I haven't gotten the chance to read the book, but I just ordered it, so I'm very excited to read it. I had well, I guess this question has two parts, and you sort of answered the first part of the question when you were talking about how there are more sort of like softer rules with like the Ukrainian refugees. But my initial question was basically, you know, do the age assessment processes, do they apply to all of these migrants like equally, you know, irrespective of national origins? And you kind of talked about how it's not really the case for Ukrainians. But I guess the more relevant part of the question is when, you know, this is happening, so you know, this sort of unequal treatment of these unaccompanied or underage youth, how does that sort of affect the ways in which they, as well as like their like legal like teams, their attorneys, the sort of ways that they approach their asylum claims or like the asylum process more generally? I'm wondering if there are sort of strategies and stuff that if they are able to secure representation, or if they're sort of gaining that knowledge on their own, how do they sort of deal with that? Because I'm assuming that, you know, these, like with the Ukrainian crisis, it's something that's, you know, has been happening for the past few years, but I don't know if it's been happening for a long enough period for it to become sort of common knowledge for those Ukrainians to be like, okay, well, I understand that we have maybe like an easier time. And so that then affecting their case construction. I'm just like, yeah, I'm very curious to see like how this then changes the construction of their cases or the ways that they approach like the asylum offices, or if it even has any effect on that at all. But yeah, very curious to see if you have any sort of thoughts on that.
Yes. So I mean, about this question of, you know, how much knowledge do they have? How much support do they have? So during this time, like in Berlin at least, but also in many other parts of Germany, like a vast volunteer infrastructure sort of emerged. So there were lots of Germans who like wanted to help young refugees and who, I mean, for the most part, were not legal experts, but really kind of, it's quite fascinating actually. They really like took the time to learn all of this legal stuff in order to help these young migrants who were arriving. I mean, I write about that too. There are issues with that, of course, you know, when people who are not legal experts are giving legal advice. That's another issue. But and yes, for sure, they pursued lots of strategies. This, you know, combined effort of trying to become a minor, but also trying to apply for asylum. I mean, one of the strategies maybe that I'll mention that I saw quite frequently was to basically like play different agencies out against each other. So, I mean, Germany is a very bureaucratic country with lots of offices and agencies and lots of paper produced. And so something, for example, that one of my interlocutors did was, so he had 2 age assessments actually in different German states, and one said he was 16 and one said he was 18. So the second one was, used as the basis for his impending Dublin deportation. Like the German state said, one of these assessments found you to be 18, so you can be deported back to Italy in his case, in accordance with the Dublin Agreement. But then he basically, with the help again of a volunteer, I mean, not by himself, he wrote a letter to this office saying, well, I have these 2 conflicting age assessments, so can you just pause put my Dublin deportation on hold until I try to fix this issue with my age? The person responsible said, okay, we'll put it on hold. So then he went with this letter that said that his Dublin deportation was on hold. He went to the family court and said, look, my Dublin deportation is on hold. So that means this office thinks I might be a minor. Can you give me a legal guardian? The family court said, okay, we'll give you a legal guardian. Then he went back to this other office with the letter from the family court saying, look, I have a legal guardian. So that means I'm a minor. And so then they accepted his minority age. There was often this kind of like walking back and forth between different agencies with papers to like prove their point. So that was one strategy, I guess. I don't know if I understood this quite correctly. Were you asking about like the role that ethnicity, for instance, plays in age assessments? So I mean, the procedures are the same no matter where someone comes from. But so I mean, I observed forensic age assessments, but I also spoke with a lot of social workers who do visual age assessments. And for the most part, it's different across the German states. But for the most part, a migrant will first undergo a visual age assessment, which is cheaper, of course. And then only if the social workers can't decide on an age or the migrant contests the result of the exam, will he be sent to a forensic exam. So lots of social workers told me that they were totally aware of the fact that they were biased, let's say, towards certain ethnicities. I mean, I think in psychology, there's this this idea of an own race bias, where people often find it easier to evaluate faces of their own race, essentially, than of a different race. So I think that definitely played out. They also said that they, you know, make differences between girls and boys and you know, all types of different people. So social workers were very much aware of that. The forensic scientists, on the other hand, kind of insisted, I mean, almost like, because I will say the critics of age assessments brought up this very fact. They said, like, you know, the reference populations that these assessments are based on, they all consist of white Europeans from the 1930s. Like, surely that can't tell us anything about migrants from sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East today. But the forensic scientists basically kind of turned the discourse around and said, oh, but you leftists always say that race is not a thing. So like race is not a thing. We just treat everyone the same here in the forensic lab. Race is just like, as you all say, it's just a social construction. So, you know, it doesn't matter here for our exams. But I mean, of course, critics argue that it does because, you know, nutrition affects like the ossification of your bones and all of that. So so I will say like it didn't matter, but some people said it should have mattered, and the social workers even admitted that it actually did matter. So that would be my answer about ethnicity or race in these assessments.
Hi, Ulrike. Thank you so much for your really great talk. As you may remember, I sent you some fan email a few months ago. I was midway reading the book, and just as David was saying, it's such a beautifully written book. Apart from the wonderful contributions it makes, it's just so beautifully written. So yeah, highly recommended, and yeah, great book. So I had 2 questions. One was about the gender dimension of the work, and you said at the beginning of the talk that you made the decision early on to focus predominantly on young men. I'm sorry if I'm misremembering, but my understanding was that this is a situation that happens with young women also, but that perhaps it's a more salient dilemma or issue for young men, which seemed to me tied up with distinctive experiences of coming of age as a young man, and also the different salience of manhood and masculinity in society at large, and whether you're a man or a boy, it kind of depends whether people see you as threatening or not, perhaps. And so I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about the gendered dimensions of this whole experience, and it'd be really interesting to hear also if you did have any interactions with young women going through this experience, how the outcomes of it were different for them and the implications of it were different for them. And the second thing was, and I'm not sure if this is going to turn into a question exactly, but one of the things that was really interesting about the talk that I didn't pick up as much in the book was, as David was saying, there's these really interesting parallels between this age classification and then the refugee migrant classification. And obviously there's a lot of literature about migrants performing vulnerability to attain refugee status and the kind of subjective implications of this. But one thing that really came through in your talk today was just the kind of internalized shame and the guilt and all these dilemmas that people have about whether they should reveal themselves and who they should reveal themselves to, and the way in which this continues throughout the life course. And I'd just love to hear more about that, and in particular, how you're conceptualizing that feeling. Is this some kind of internalized stigma? Like, what is it, I guess, conceptually? Be really interested to hear you talk more about that. So thank you so much.
Yes, so about the first question about gender, yes, I also encountered lots of women. I mean, first of all, being involved with this organization, there were female migrants who needed guardians. Then, of course, the young migrants also knew young women. So I met their, girlfriends or friends or acquaintances or whatever. And I mean, the main differences, so I think you've already kind of mentioned them. One is just the kind of public image of migrants. Like in this 2015-16 crisis moment, like young men were very much like the image that was perpetuated in the German media as like that created fear. And so, I mean, I'll just give you one example. So even though at that point, the vast majority, I want to say something like 95% of unaccompanied minors in Germany in this 2016 moment were men. But regardless, there were several organizations, not just the one that I worked for, but other organizations as well, who were matching volunteer legal guardians and unaccompanied minors. And the way that these organizations advertised throughout Berlin and were trying to get Germans to be interested in becoming a legal guardian was with posters of girls, like young migrant girls. And I asked like the founders of one of the organizations, like, why would you have all these posters with girls? Because when Germans come, they're going to be assigned a young man. Like we hardly have any girls. And she said, yeah, but we would not be able to pique Germans' interest. Like no one wants to volunteer for young men. People want to volunteer for young girls. And then maybe once they've signed up, you can convince them to take a young man. But like, so that's just one example that I think shows you that the discourse was very different around young men and young women. And then also like this issue about feeling infantilized in youth welfare, and this kind of, realizing that minority age doesn't just come with all of these resources, it also comes with, someone basically supervising you. I think that's just much harder for young men because masculinity is really tied up with age in a way that femininity isn't, or maybe it's almost tied up in a reverse way, that even being younger, more feminine, being older, more masculine, something like that. So I think that these issues were really just very different. And then also, I mean, I will say that the girls that I came to know, they faced issues that I thought were really important, but that were too important not to focus on in a study, but that would kind of distract from the thing that I wanted to focus on, which was this whole issue about age and identity. So I thought, like, I can't write about the girls and not write about these really important things that are going on with them. But so then it's better to like focus on a group of people like the young men. So that was a decision I made. But I mean, I do know girls, and I mentioned some girls in the book where I think that their gender isn't as important as this other thing I want to talk about, like the identity. But I would say these two things, like femininity being tied up with age in a different way than masculinity, and then this image of young migrants in Germany, that was the reason why I chose young men. Your question about how I would conceptualize what is going on. Is it internalized stigma? Is it shame? I mean, I don't want to, commit to one of these terms, but yeah, I would say it's something like that. I think it's something like internalized stigma. It's something like, I mean, your values not aligning with your actions. It's something like realizing that, like, practical benefits only get you so far. I don't know. I mean, I think there's also some kind of pressure for these young migrants to, at some point you want to stop being a migrant and being a refugee. You want to just be a normal part of the society. But in Germany, as in the US or other countries, like a birth date is it's such a central part of our identity that it's something that also often comes up. You're asked, like, what's your birthday? What's your star sign? Well, all of that. So it's just something that doesn't go away. So yeah, I would say it's something like internalized stigma, but I will think about that more to see if there's a more fitting term. But yeah, thank you for those two questions.
Thank you so much, Ulrike, for such a wonderful talk and for sharing your research with us. I learned so much, and I really appreciated hearing from the audience and David, your questions and thoughts about the work. And I wish you lots of luck with the work you're doing now on legal status. And thanks everybody for coming today. If we could all just offer a round of applause virtually to Ulrike for this fabulous work. Is there anything else, Warren, Anna, David, that needs to be addressed at this point logistically, or announcements or anything like that?
No, our next seminar will be on January 31st, same time.
Okay, so I look forward to seeing many of you there, and thank you again.
Everyone, this was great. Thank you.